Okay, so this video is for those that have just started learning a language or still don't know how to use the language particularly well. I will be teaching you how to go from knowing close to nothing about a language to being able to use the language to watch series, read books, and play games that are in that target language. This video will be divided into 3 parts. Part 1 is the first few focus points, and part 2 is tips and tricks that help you really cut down on the time that you spend in this beginner stage. Part 3 is optional bonuses. Now, part 1, here are the first 2 things that I'm going to focus on when I start learning a new language. A working vocabulary is the first thing. I'm talking about having about 200 words and a basic understanding of how sentences are built up in my target language. Let's break that down a bit, because if you get this quickly, then that's the difference between you starting to read actual fiction after a month of studying and you waiting a year and a half before you start reading. Now, what do I mean by a working vocabulary? That simply means words that you know and are able to understand how are used in a sentence. The quickest way to do this is going to be downloading an app like Anki and making flashcards for the 200 most common words in the language, which you can find online very easily. It takes a bit of work to set up, but it is super fast and you'll be fairly familiar with it within a month. However, this is not something that I would do if I was just learning a language for fun. I find that extremely boring and not something that I really want to spend my time doing when I'm just starting out learning a new language, which is something that I do for fun. Now, the way that I would go about getting that knowledge is really quite simple. I would just start using a language learning app. A bonus tip for you is that you should not be focusing on adjectives using that language learning app, as they're mostly used as filler words and words that you use to spice up your language. You don't need those just to be able to communicate. It sounds quite boring, but this is also the only point in your journey where I would suggest using a language learning app. So if you can get through this stage and you're not interested in maintaining your streak on Duolingo or whatever app you decided to go with, then feel free to uninstall the app. Just make sure that if you went for the premium, that you cancel the subscription as well. As for learning how sentences are structured in your target language, the way to do that is also really quite simple. You're going to be learning that at the same time as you're learning the words by using the app. Just make sure that you try to take note of where certain types of words show up in sentences. For instance, where is the verb in the sentence, and does that change depending on whether it is a normal sentence or a question? If you really don't want to use language learning apps, then there are free resources online for basically any language that will go through the basic structure of sentences, or you could buy yourself a basic grammar book. I would not recommend that either, as I find it more useful knowing these things implicitly rather than having textbook knowledge in the beginning. Step 2 is tips and tricks. You'll notice that I didn't mention anything about movies or series in step 1, even though watching content in your target language is definitely useful for language learning. I would actually suggest holding off on that until you're a bit more experienced, as that is probably more likely to leave you feeling discouraged rather than entertained. Instead, a tip that I would use is to watch things in a language that you already know, but with subtitles in your target language. Now, most people are able to go for the most part to watch stuff with subtitles and more or less ignore them if they're not in a language that you know. Bonus points for any show where you manage to find subtitles marked with CC, as that means closed captions, which are subtitles that are extra accurate, translated versions of what the actors are actually saying. Tip number 2 is for you to set your phone to your new target language. This really is something that I'm not even considering optional at this point, as it gives me so much free vocabulary. I know just because of how much I'm using my phone, what every single setting and option that I interact with daily do, that means that I'm going to be learning these words just because I know what they are supposed to be in a language that I'm familiar with, and therefore I understand them implicitly. Hey there, do the things in this video sound useful? Great. All of these videos are going to be available forever so that you can use them to learn whatever language that you might want. But if you need anything more specifically made for you, then simply send me either a message on Instagram or an email. That's it. Back to the free learning you go. Part 3 is about optional bonuses, and these are just the extra things that I wouldn't really suggest doing unless you really want to go the extra mile. The first one is going to have classes with an actual teacher. I spend most of my time learning on my own and then using that language to communicate with others. But if you're feeling a bit lost, then there are sites such as italki, where you can schedule a lesson with a teacher of whatever language you may want to learn. That is extremely pricey in most cases though, and therefore I much prefer just studying on my own. Some places also offer their own in-person courses that you can take to learn almost any language. The second option is also likely to come with some sort of homework based on stuff that you're learning in the course. This makes it a lot more effective, but unless the person in charge of the course is being particularly careful, then it can also sometimes end up feeling like a chore and therefore less motivating, especially if this is something that you do for fun. The most important thing to remember when you start studying a new language is that this is something that will end up taking a long time. It is therefore more important to make sure that you're doing it in a way that is enjoyable rather than the most efficient way. Now, this video has not covered how to read different types of scripts such as kanji in Japanese or how you would go about learning these things. If you want to learn a language like that, then it's going to take more work to learn how to write and read, and the things you do to start off are probably going to be a bit different, or they will at least include these things. But if you're going to be learning a language that uses a different script, then in some cases it might be sufficient to just learn how the script works in the beginning, and then you'll be able to move on to other things. But if you're learning Japanese, for instance, where each word has its own sign, then there really is no way around just having to memorize a bunch of signs. I'm going to be deciding what my next language after French is going to be quite soon, and at the moment it's between Japanese and Greek. That means that there might eventually be a video on how I learn with languages with other scripts, but as I still have a ways to go, I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for that. I'm still not particularly close to feeling confident in my French yet. I hope you found this video helpful and that you now know a bit more on how to start if that was something that was a bit vague before. As always, best of luck with your studies and neck out.